At 4:18 in the morning, in a rail yard swallowed by fog, the last thing I wanted was to climb into any rail car. But Darnell had radioed me. There was a form to fill out before 6, and I was the only inspector available. 20 years on the job teaches you one thing. When the shift calls, you go. I'm telling this now, months later, trying to explain how I ended up out there without being summoned by anyone else, without asking for extra clearance, without thinking twice. It was protocol. You climb up, check the seal, photograph it, write down the plate numbers on the side panel, climb back down. 20 minutes, maybe less. I'd probably done it 700 times in the 22 years I've worked at the no-shay yard. The fog was heavy that night. Kansas City gets like that in November. A low mist that rolls in off the Missouri River and settles between the rows of rail cars, deadening the sound like the whole world had pressed its hands over its own ears. From the South Branch entrance, I could see maybe 6 or 7 cars ahead of me. After that, nothing. Gray metal dissolving into white, the cold bit. I had my work gloves on, the leather ones I should have replaced last month because the seam on the right one was giving out. But I'm lazy about that kind of thing. The air smelled like diesel oil, rust, and something vaguely vegetal I'd never been able to pin down. Grass, maybe. Or some grain that had leaked out of a hopper car weeks back and gotten stuck between the ballast rocks. That smell is part of the place. Once you've worked a rail yard long enough, it becomes as normal as the smell of your own house. I climbed the side ladder of the tank car without rushing. The ladder was wet, the metal rung slippery, and I held on carefully, not out of fear, but because a 47-year-old man learns not to test his luck on wet surfaces in the dark. At the top, the inspection platform was narrow, about 20 inches wide, and I crouched near the seal to photograph it with my flashlight in my mouth like an idiot, because my chest mount had broken the week before, and I still hadn't ordered a new one from the supply room. The seal was definitely broken, not torn, cut. The difference matters on the form. You write clean cut, likely intentional, and that kicks off a whole other chain of procedures. I photographed it from 3 angles, wrote the plate numbers in the small notebook I keep in my chest pocket, and that's when I heard the first impact. It came from the roof of the next car, a general freight car, covered flatbed, sitting about 12 feet ahead. A dull, heavy thud like something had dropped from a considerable height. It didn't roll. It didn't slide. It stopped. I lifted my head after the jolt, aimed my flashlight in that direction. Fog. Wet metal roof reflecting the light back at me. Nothing. I waited. The noise in a rail yard is constant. Switcher cars in the distance, the groan of wheels as trains settle, the brake system releasing air in uneven cycles. But that impact had been different. Closer. With a weight that didn't match a small animal. Then came the second one. Same spot, same weight. A thud, and then silence. Not the normal silence of the yard. A different silence. The kind where you realize the background noise has gone with it. Like the whole environment had decided to pay attention to the same thing you were. I stood still for another 30 seconds or so. Right then I was genuinely torn between some large animal climbed up on the car somehow, and some homeless guy decided to sleep on the roof in all this cold. Both explanations were inconvenient. Neither one was specifically scary. I decided to climb down. I went back to the side ladder, put my foot on the first rung, and that's when the sound started below. Not an impact, not a knock. It was a displacement. Weight moving through the ballast rocks between the rails. Slow, methodical, without the uneven rhythm of human footsteps. A man walking through that space trips on the rocks, drags his feet, stops, starts again. This was different. It was a continuous cadence. Like whatever it was had no concern for where it was stepping, because there was simply no reason to be concerned. I stopped on the ladder, flashlight aimed down, into the dark gap between the cars. The fog was too thick at that level. I could see the beam spreading out into the white, reaching maybe 6 feet before it dissolved completely. I saw nothing. The sound continued for about 10 seconds. Rocks settling, metal creaking somewhere farther off, and then the silence came back. Different from the silence above. Denser. the kind of silence that takes up space. I climbed back up to the platform, not as a rational decision. I just climbed, my knees making that sound they make now when I bend fast. I spent about 20 minutes up there in the cold, my hand on the radio without pressing the button. I'd have to explain what I'd heard, and what I'd heard was, objectively, nothing reportable. A sound. Sounds in a rail yard at night aren't a report. They're atmosphere, they're background noise. They're exactly the kind of thing an inspector with 22 years on the job shouldn't be calling in at 4:30 in the morning, like he had something important to say. So I stayed up there, stared into the fog. The Missouri River was about 1.5 miles away, invisible, but I could feel the moisture it pushed up into the air at that hour. At some point I remembered I'd left my car running with the heat on, that I was burning gas for nothing. That's the kind of thing your mind thinks about when it doesn't want to think about the rest. I stayed up top for too long. I know that now. At the time, I convinced myself I was being cautious, waiting for the sound to repeat, waiting for some reasonable explanation to surface out of nowhere the way things usually do in a yard at night. A fox coming out of the ballast. A tie-down bolt that gave way inside the car and knocked something loose. The Noche yard has an explanation for almost everything if you wait long enough. But the sound didn't come back, and that's what kept me standing there. The cold had worked its way through my jacket to the point where I could barely feel my fingers. The torn glove wasn't helping. There was a drip coming from somewhere along the joint between two cars farther ahead, a steady metallic tapping hitting a puddle that had formed in the ballast rocks below. That was the only sound. The whole yard had gone quiet in a way I couldn't describe then and still can't now. It wasn't the silence of the early morning hours which has its own texture, the distant hum of the city, the brake system releasing air every now and then, some car on Route 169 on the other side of the wall. This was something else. It was absence. I pressed the radio button. Darnell. Static. Then his voice, hoarse, clearly bothered about the hour. Blake, you done? Seals cut, confirmed. Already got the photos. Good. Feel the HM5 when you get to the office. Anyone else on the South Branch right now? A short pause, the kind that means he's checking something. No. Why? I didn't answer right away. I kept staring into the fog ahead of me, at the roof of the next car where I'd heard the two impacts, at the white nothing beyond that. Heard a noise, probably an animal. Fox, most likely. Kowalczyk spotted one on the East Branch last week. Probably. I clicked off. Ray Kowalczyk is the kind of man who chalks everything he can't explain up to a fox. One time he attributed an entire ladder step bracket, bent upward at an angle no animal that size could manage, to a fox. I never said anything because Ray is 61 years old and deserves the peace of his own explanations. That's when the radio crackled again. Different frequency, the inspection shift channel. Owen, female voice, young, slightly tense. Celia Marsh, her first solo night shift. I knew that because Darnell had asked me to keep an eye out. Not officially, just the kind of informal request you make when you're sending a trainee out alone into a yard at 3 in the morning. She was on the North Branch, on the other side of the main consist. I'm here. Something's off on the North Branch. The dogs in the East Warehouse stopped barking. I knew what she was describing before she finished the sentence. There were 2 German shepherds on security detail in the maintenance warehouse, about 300 yards north. They barked at everything, passing trains, wind, shadows, their own imagination. But they'd also stopped a few break-ins. Going completely silent was the kind of thing that Celia, in her first month on the job, would flag as abnormal. The kind of thing that I, in 22 years, had learned not to log. But I was on top of a tank car on the South Branch in the cold because of a sound I couldn't explain. Where exactly are you? I asked. Ladder on car 33, North Branch. I was checking wheel wear. Get down, head to the office. Silence on the radio. Then, did something happen? No, but there's no reason for you to be stuck on a ladder in this cold. Finish the wheel check tomorrow. She agreed with an ease that struck me, at the time, as relief in disguise. Months later, I still think about that she'd probably wanted to leave that branch for a while. and just needed someone with more seniority to give her the out. I stayed up on top of the tank car for another 5 minutes or so. The fog was beginning to lift, very slightly. Not enough to see any farther, but enough to notice that the darkness had shifted in tone. The sky overhead was moving from black to a dull, deep blue, maybe 90 minutes to sunrise. The contrast was unsettling in a way I hadn't expected. Everything was becoming marginally more visible. The outlines of the cars, the wet gleam of the rails, the vague shapes of the warehouses farther off. But that was making the fog denser at ballast level, not less. As if the rising light had pushed the mist downward, concentrating it exactly where I needed it least. I looked into the gap between the cars. I could see more than before. I could see the ballast rocks, gray, uneven, wet. I could see the underside of the cars, the rusted metal of the crossbeams, the brake hoses hanging down. I could see the rail gleaming on both sides. I could also see the mark in the ballast. It was about 10 feet from the tank car I was on to the left of the tracks. A depression in the rocks, not the kind that happens when water pools and gradually sinks the ballast over time, but the kind that happens when considerable weight presses down on that spot all at once. The surrounding rocks were pushed outward, like a small, shallow crater. One mark, then another about 6 feet ahead on the same side. I didn't follow them with the flashlight, not out of fear, or not mainly out of fear, because I'd shifted into the mode I go into when I see something in the yard that shouldn't be there. I take one look, file it internally, decide what to do without rushing. 22 years on the job builds that into you, a kind of deliberate slow motion that people sometimes mistake for courage, and that is really just habit. What I saw in those marks was simple. Something heavy had been there. It had moved in the direction of the south branch, and the spacing between the marks was wrong for a man. Too wide and too deep. I reached for the radio again, held it without pressing the button. I didn't know what I was going to say to Darnell. I didn't know what I was going to say to anyone. Over in the east warehouse, the dogs were still silent. I climbed down the ladder carefully, not because of the marks, or not only because of them. The left knee joint was locking up from the cold, and I needed to move before I became completely useless on that wet metal. That's the kind of practical decision your body makes for you when you've been standing still too long on a November night. I stepped onto the ballast. The rocks gave slightly under my weight the way they always do, and the sound was dry and familiar. I stood still for 2 seconds, listening. The yard was still quiet in that same strange way. No wind. The fog was motionless, thick at rail level, with that cold glow of a sky that's starting to lighten but hasn't quite decided yet. I walked over to the marks. There were 4 of them that I could see. 2 on the left side of the tracks, 2 on the right, alternating. The pattern of something that had moved between the cars heading north to south. The rocks around each depression were pushed outward evenly, without the irregularity you'd expect from a fall or a rolling object. This was pressure applied straight down, weight in motion. I pulled off my right glove and ran my fingers along the edge of one of them. The rocks were cold, wet, like everything else that morning. No residual warmth. Whatever it was, it had come through here a while back. Maybe before I'd climbed the tank car, maybe much earlier. There was no way to know. What I did know was the spacing. A little over 6 feet between each mark. Too long a stride for any man walking normally, and too wide laterally to be a human running stride. I'm no expert on tracks. I'm a car inspector, not a hunter. But 22 years walking on this kind of surface teaches you to recognize what's human and what isn't. This wasn't human. I photographed the marks with my phone, the flash strobing white in the fog, and felt vaguely stupid doing it without knowing exactly who I was going to send the photos to or what I was going to write to go with them. Found this in the ballast. Anyone know what it is? That wasn't the kind of message you sent to the shift supervisor at 4:30 in the morning. I put my phone away and looked north, toward where the marks were coming from. That's when the dogs in the east warehouse started barking again, but not the way they normally did. The German shepherds on security duty at the Noche yard have a repertoire that anyone with a few months on the job learns to read. There's the territorial bark, low, spaced out, the one they do when a vehicle pulls through the south gate. There's the boredom bark, Uneven, half-hearted, the one they set off at nothing in particular. And there's the alarm bark, which is sharp, continuous, and keeps building. What they were doing now was none of those three. It was short, muffled, like each bark was being cut off midway by something. Not silence, but containment. The kind of sound a dog makes when it wants to bark and at the same time doesn't, when instinct is in conflict with something deeper than instinct. I stared in the direction of the warehouse, which I couldn't see through the fog in the distance. The barking continued for about 40 seconds in that strange pattern and then stopped. Not gradually. It just stopped, like someone had switched off the sound. After that, nothing. I walked a little farther between the cars, flashlight aimed at the ballast, following the marks north. They continued for about 50 feet before disappearing into a stretch where the ballast was more compact and dry, sheltered from moisture by the shadow of a larger flat car. There, the rocks didn't give enough to hold an impression. I stopped, looked up. The flat car to my left was empty, cargo already offloaded, loose tie-down straps hanging from the sides. Its floor sat about 28 inches above the rail, and there was a gap of roughly 6 feet between it and the next car. On the roof of the covered car to my right, there was a gouge in the metal I hadn't noticed before. A long, irregular dent running about 30 inches along the longitudinal axis. Not rust. Not wear. It was recent. The exposed metal underneath had the silver sheen of a fresh surface. I held my flashlight on the gouge for a stretch of time that was probably longer than it needed to be. I was baffled. The edge of the dent had a shape I couldn't quite organize in my head. Not the rounded look of an object impact. Not the linear mark of a tool scratch. It was something between the two. Multiple pressure points close together, applied all at once. I took another photo. The flash left me momentarily blind, and the 2 seconds I spent waiting for my vision to come back were the 2 longest seconds of that night. When I could see again, the fog was the same, the yard was quiet the same, and I was alone the same. But something had changed, not in the environment, in me. There was a point in the middle of my chest that had gone tight in a way that wasn't exactly fear. It was recognition. The kind of feeling you get when enough data comes in to form a conclusion you'd rather not reach. There was something large in that yard. Not a man. Not a fox, the way Kowalczyk would have said. Not anything I could name easily. I walked back toward the tank car, slow, without running. Running on dark ballast is the kind of decision that breaks an ankle and solves nothing. I made my way back, looking left and right every 3 or 4 steps, flashlight sweeping the shadows under the cars. Before climbing back up to the platform, I stopped and stood listening for almost a full minute. Nothing. Just the drip from the leak up ahead. Steady, patient, in no hurry at all. I climbed up, stood on top of the tank car with my hands in my pockets, and looked out at the Noche yard spreading in every direction. Swallowed by fog, cut through by rails I couldn't see, dotted by the orange glow of light poles that barely reached the ground. I thought about the HM5 I needed to file before 6. I thought about my car heater that was probably burning gas for nothing. I thought that I should have brought coffee. I called Darnell at 5:20, not because I knew what to say. I called because standing on top of a tank car in the dark, staring at marks in the ballast that made no sense, is the kind of situation where a reasonable man eventually decides he needs another human voice nearby, even if that voice belongs to Darnell Pruitt, who is 34 years old and has the patience of someone who spent too many nights awake without a good reason. Blake, you done out there? I need you to send someone to the South Branch. A pause. Something happened with the car. Not with the car. There are marks in the ballast I can't identify. And there's a dent on the roof of flat car 12 that wasn't in the last inspection report. Another pause. Longer. Marks from what? And there it was. I was looking at the photos on my phone. The depression in the rocks, the spacing, the gouge in the metal. And I knew exactly what I'd photographed. I just didn't know the name of what I'd photographed. And a 22-year inspector who calls his shift supervisor at 5 in the morning and says, "I don't know what I'm looking at," is really saying something else entirely. He's saying something is wrong with him. Passage marks. Something heavy came through here. A vehicle? No. An animal? I paused for too long. Send someone, Darnell. He sent Celia. That was the mistake. I don't blame Darnell. He had me and her as his options that shift, and I was already on the South Branch. So the logic was for her to cover the 300 yards from the North Branch to where I was. It makes sense on paper. It makes sense if you don't know what I knew at that moment, which was little but was enough to know that sending a 28-year-old woman alone across the Noche yard in that fog was the wrong call. I stayed on top of the tank car and waited. And it was during that wait that the real questioning began. Because I'm a practical man, I learned to be out of necessity. This job has no room for people who sit and chew over what they saw or didn't see. You log it, document it, deal with it, move on. And I had tried to apply that method to the marks in the ballast, to the sound I'd heard, to the silence of the dogs, to the gouge in the metal. I'd tried to organize all of it into a cause and effect chain that made sense. I couldn't do it. The problem wasn't that the evidence pointed to something impossible. The problem was simpler and more unsettling than that. The evidence pointed to something I couldn't name, and I had realized, up there in the cold, that there was an important difference between impossible and nameless. Impossible things you dismiss. Nameless things stay with you. What I knew. Something heavy had moved between the cars. It had climbed onto metal roofs. It had moved with a cadence that was not human, and was not any animal I could identify in this region. It had been within a few yards of me without my seeing anything but fog. What I didn't know, where it was now. And that was the part that kept coming back in a way I didn't like. Not what it had been, where it was, because an animal, any size, if you can't see it, it's somewhere. It's in a specific place, with specific coordinates, existing at a point in space that has a measurable distance from where you're standing. And I was in a yard 200 yards wide by 400 long, with about 20 feet of visibility in any direction, and something the size I was inferring was in that space and I didn't know where. I tried to run the numbers. The inspector's habit of measuring spaces mentally. The South Branch had 17 cars. Each car averaged about 50 feet in length. The gaps between them ranged from 6 to 12 feet. There was shadow underneath every single one of them. I stopped running the numbers. The radio crackled. Owen, I'm at the junction of the Central and South Branches. It was Celia, voice controlled but with something underneath it that I recognized. I can't see you. Raise your flashlight. I turned mine on and aimed it at the sky. You see me? Got you. Coming. I heard her footsteps on the ballast. Uneven, quick, the sound of someone who wants to get there fast and isn't embarrassed to show it. I tracked her with my light until she came out of the fog, orange vest and inspection pack on her back, and the look of someone who'd spent too long alone in the dark and was genuinely glad to see a light on. She climbed the side ladder without me asking, stood next to me on the narrow platform, looking out at the yard. What did you see? I showed her the photos on my phone. She looked at them for a while, swiping from one to the next, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Wide spacing, she said. Yeah. Deep, too. Yeah. She handed my phone back without saying what she was thinking, which was, strangely, the most honest answer she could have given. Because if she'd said probably an animal, I would have agreed on instinct, and we both would have climbed down and left and pretended the matter was closed. Her silence meant she didn't have a name for it either. The two of us stood there in the cold for a few seconds, looking out at the South Branch stretching ahead of us in the fog. 17 cars. Shadow underneath everyone. Did you hear anything on your way over? I asked. No. I didn't say anything more. But I ran the same calculation she was probably running, because it was the obvious one. The one any person with any sense would run right then. If there was something large in that yard, and she hadn't heard anything coming from the north, then one of two things was true. The thing had gone somewhere else, or the thing was standing still. We decided to climb down together. It wasn't a discussed decision. It was the kind of thing that happens when two adults are on top of a rail car in the dark and simultaneously realize that staying put isn't an option. Celia went down first. I followed, knee protesting on the third rung, and the two of us stood on the ballast for a moment, shoulders almost touching. Flashlights aimed in opposite directions. The plan was simple. Walk down the center axis of the South Branch, straight to the operations office, a little over 300 yards north. No detours, no stops. The HM5 could wait. Everything could wait. We started walking. The ballast made its normal sound underfoot, rocks giving, shifting, settling back. Celia walked to my right, one step ahead, flashlight sweeping the space between the cars on her side. I covered the left. The fog had lifted slightly at rail level, just enough to see about 25 feet before the white closed in. Not much, but better than before. We passed the flat car with the gouge on the roof. I looked up out of habit. The gouge was there, silver gleam against dark metal. From ground level, it looked bigger than it had in the photos. We kept going. It was about 40 yards later that Celia stopped. She didn't say anything. She just stopped, one hand raised slightly, the universal hold-on gesture, and went still. I followed her gaze to the left, into the corridor between the hopper car and the refrigerated car sitting 2 yards beyond it. The reefer's side door was open. That wasn't unusual in itself. Refrigerated car doors sometimes came unlatched, especially the older ones with worn-out seals. But the inspection report for that consist, which I'd read before leaving the office, listed the reefer as sealed. Cargo inside, pending customs clearance. Door sealed from the outside. The seal was on the ground, intact, not broken, not cut, removed. I stared at the seal for too long. Something in my brain was trying to build an explanation and couldn't find enough material to work with. Seals don't come off on their own. Seals require hands, fingers, intent. Was it like this when you came through? I asked quietly. I hadn't gotten this far yet. I moved closer slowly. The door was open about 2 feet, enough for complete darkness inside, enough for the smell that hit me when I got near. It was a dense smell, layered. First came the industrial cold, the stale air of a refrigerated chamber that calls to mind a butcher shop and metal. Then, underneath that, something else. Something organic, warm, completely out of place in that cold. Like when you open a trash can in the summer, and the first breath convinces you to close it immediately. I shone my flashlight through the opening. Plastic crates stacked up, metal racks along the walls, the ribbed metal floor with its anti-slip grooves. Everything in place. Nothing overturned, nothing knocked over. Except for one rack on the back wall. It was one of the internal ventilation grates, sitting about 6 feet up, held in by 4 screws. It was bent outward, not ripped off, not broken. Bent as if something had pushed from the inside with steady pressure until the metal gave. The screws were still in their holes, but the threads had stripped, and the grate was angled outward at about 45 degrees. I stared at it. Celia came up behind me, looked over my shoulder, and said nothing for a considerable stretch. "From the inside," she said finally. "Yeah." No further explanation needed. The grate had been bent from the inside out. Something had been inside that refrigerated car, and had gotten out through the ventilation grate. A grate that was, at most, 16 inches wide by 24 inches tall. I closed the reefer door carefully without noise. I'm not entirely sure why. Instinct, maybe. The same instinct that makes you close a window without knowing exactly what's on the other side. We kept walking. About 60 feet later, the radio crackled. It was the dispatcher, not Darnell. Different voice, drier, with the slow drawl of someone who'd spent the whole night in an office with bad coffee. "Inspector Blake, we have a consist coming in on the South Branch in approximately 40 minutes. Clearance confirmed for the main axis." 40 minutes. That meant I needed to be off the South Branch in 40 minutes, because when a consist starts moving in a closed yard, the space between the cars stops being a corridor and becomes a trap. I confirmed I was aware and clicked off. Celia looked at me. "We walk faster," I said. "We walked faster." That's when we heard the breathing. I don't have another word for it. That's what it was. Breathing. Coming from the right, from the space under the hopper car, in the dark beneath the frame where the fog was thickest. It wasn't fast. It was slow, deep, with a long interval between the inhale and the exhale, like the rhythm of something that was completely still and completely awake at the same time. We both stopped. I didn't move my flashlight. I know that sounds wrong, but I didn't move it. There was a part of me that understood, in a very direct and very calm way, that lighting up that space was going to confirm something I wasn't prepared to have confirmed at 5 in the morning in a rail yard. The breathing continued. 8, 10 seconds. Steady, patient. Then it stopped. There was no movement I could detect, no sound of footsteps on the ballast, no creak of metal. The breathing was there, and then it wasn't. And the silence that replaced it was different from the silence before. It had weight, it had temperature, it had the specific quality of a space that had just been vacated by something that didn't want to be seen. I walked the remaining 300 yards without stopping once. Celia stayed beside me the whole way, 1 step, 2 steps, shoulders straight, flashlight steady. We didn't run. Not because we were brave, but because the only thing worse than walking slowly through that yard was the thought of what might happen if we started to run. We reached the operations office with 32 minutes to spare before the consist came in. I closed the door, sat down in the first chair I found. Celia stood in the middle of the room, still in her orange vest, staring out at the yard through the window. "Owen," she said, without taking her eyes off the fog outside. "I know," I said. The operations office on the South Branch is a room of about 200 square feet with 2 windows, one door to the yard and another to the internal hallway that leads to the maintenance warehouse. 3 desks, a schedule board on the wall, a coffee maker nobody ever cleans properly, and a corner electric heater that purrs like an old cat. I'd worked in that room hundreds of times. I know exactly how many steps it is from the door to the coffee maker. That morning it felt smaller than it ever had. Not physically. The walls were in the same place, the windows the same size. It was something else, the feeling that the boundaries of the available space were contracting from the outside, not the inside. As if the yard out there was expanding and the room was shrinking at the same rate, and the 2 of us caught in the middle of it without having asked to be. Celia had taken off her vest and was sitting on the edge of a desk, phone in hand, looking at the photos I'd sent her during the walk. She hadn't commented on them yet. She kept swiping from one to the next with her thumb, slowly, with the expression of someone trying to find the photo that solves the problem, and realizing that photo doesn't exist. I filled out half the HM5, stopped in the middle. I couldn't remember the seal's serial number, which was in the notebook I'd left in my jacket pocket, which was hanging on the hook by the door. I got up to get it, looked out the window as I passed. The consist had come in on the main axis of the South Branch. I could see the engineer's signal lights blinking orange in the fog, slow, methodical. The train was moving at a crawl, yard speed, 3 or 4 miles an hour. But it was moving, and as it advanced, the stationary cars were being pushed into their final positions, closing off the side corridors one by one. Every car that locked into place blocked off a route. I hadn't thought about it in those exact terms before seeing it with my own eyes. I'd heard the dispatcher's warning, processed it as needing to clear the branch in time, but hadn't pictured what it concretely meant for whatever was out there. Not for us. For the thing, though. Because if the side corridors were closing, and if there was something large in that yard moving between the cars, then the space available to that something was shrinking at the same rate the train was advancing. Not for us. We were inside, safe, with walls and a door and an electric heater. For that thing out there. I grabbed my jacket, went back to the desk, sat down. "Does Darnell know what's going on?" Celia asked without looking up from her phone. "He knows there are marks in the ballast I couldn't identify." "That's it? That's it." She set her phone face down on the desk, crossed her arms. There was a small pen mark on her left wrist that I noticed without meaning to. A scribbled arrow shape, the kind you make when you're on the phone and not paying attention. I didn't ask what it was. "The grate bent from the inside," she said. "How long do you think that had been there?" No way to know. But it wasn't in the previous inspection report. No. So it was recent. Yeah. She went quiet. Outside, the train continued its slow maneuver, and with each new coupling there was a dull impact that traveled down the rail and reached the office walls as vibration. The corner heater hummed, The coffee maker had a red light on that nobody had switched on deliberately. It was like that when we arrived and neither of us had touched it. It was Celia who saw it first. She was facing the north window, and I had my back to it. I saw it in her expression before I turned. Not exactly fear, but the specific stiffening of someone whose eyes have landed on something the brain is still catching up to. I turned slowly. Outside the north window, about 20 feet away, there was a gap between two cars that the maneuvering train hadn't closed yet. A narrow corridor, maybe 6 feet wide, weakly lit by the orange glow of the nearest light pole. At the far end of that corridor, something was standing still. It was hard to see clearly. The fog was concentrated there, and the angle of the light created more shadow than definition. But there was a shape. Tall, very tall for the space, in a way that didn't immediately make sense, because the top of the shape was nearly level with the roof of the car. And wide, too, with an asymmetry in the shoulders that I kept staring at for too long trying to work out. It was still. Completely still. But there was movement. Just one detail, small, that took me a few seconds to identify. The breathing. The same slow, deep rhythm we'd heard under the hopper car, now visible. The chest, if that's what it was, expanding and contracting regularly, slowly, with a patience that had nothing of a nervous or cornered animal in it. It was watching us. I can't prove that. I didn't see eyes, didn't see a face, didn't see anything with enough definition to state it with certainty. But there was an orientation to the shape, a positioning that pointed directly at the window where Celia and I were standing, and a quality of attention that I can't describe any other way except to say that I felt it. Like when you walk into a room and know someone was waiting for you before you even see who it is. Celia didn't move. I didn't move. The train kept advancing. The corridor between the two cars narrowed inch by inch, slowly, inevitably, and the shape at the far end stayed put as the space around it shrank. It didn't back away. It didn't turn. It stayed exactly where it was as the cars closed in from both sides. 3 feet of corridor, 2, 1. The final coupling was an impact that shook the floor beneath our feet. The corridor closed. The shape disappeared behind the metal. No sound from outside. No impact of flight. No creak of a car pressed by lateral weight. Nothing. Celia exhaled. I hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath until I heard the air go out. The heater hummed. The red light on the coffee maker was still on. I grabbed the radio and called Darnell. I was going to need better words than the ones I'd used before. Words that wouldn't make me sound like a man who'd worked 22 years in a rail yard and lost his mind on a November night. Words that would do what words need to do when a situation is real and urgent and completely nameless. I held the radio for a long time without pressing the button. Outside, the yard was silent. Darnell called at 5:42. Not on the radio. On his cell phone, which meant it was something he didn't want on the shift's communication log. I picked up before the second ring. Blake, Harmon's on the South Branch. I closed my eyes for a second. Pete Harmon was a temp worker, hired 3 weeks back to cover the December shortage. Somewhere in his 50s, from somewhere in Kansas, the kind of man who learns just enough not to get fired and not enough to be useful in an emergency. He was supposed to be doing a visual inspection walk on the east axis of the South Branch. A simple task, 30 minutes, that someone had forgotten to cancel when the switcher came in. Did you try his radio? 6 times. Nothing. Cell phone? Goes straight to voicemail. I looked at Celia. She was listening from beside me and was already up from the desk. How long until the consist clears? I asked. 25 minutes. Blake, if he's on the east axis when the train... I know. I hung up, grabbed my jacket. Celia grabbed hers. You're not coming, I said. She looked at me with an expression that was neither defiance nor fear. It was assessment. The kind of look a person gives when they're deciding whether to spend energy arguing or just do what needs to be done. 2 different routes, she said. We find him faster. There was no argument against that wasn't paternalism dressed up as caution. I split the branch. She took the west axis, I took the east, and we went out. The cold outside was different from the cold before. Drier, deeper. The sky was almost a clear blue now. That pre-dawn shade that doesn't light anything up but takes away the total black. The fog had dropped even lower, almost level with the rail, and I could see the cars more clearly than during the night, which also meant I could see how much the switcher had changed the layout of the branch. The side corridors I'd used for walking during the night were closed off. There were maybe 4 passages left between the cars, spread out over the 400 yards of the branch, each one about 5 or 6 feet wide at most. Enough space for a man. I entered the east axis calling Harmon's name in a controlled voice. Not a shout, not a whisper. The kind of call that carries distance without broadcasting anxiety. The ballast was drier on this side, more compact, and my steps made less noise. An advantage and a disadvantage at the same time. I passed the first cross corridor. Empty. I passed the second. Empty. It was in the third corridor that I found Harmon's hat. It was sitting in the center of the corridor in the ballast, completely in the wrong place to have fallen off a head moving normally. No sign of Harmon. I picked up the hat, a dark navy wool beanie with the faded logo of some baseball team I didn't recognize, and kept going. 20 yards later, I heard the breathing. This time it was different. It wasn't under a car, wasn't 6 yards away behind a window. It was close, very close, coming from above, from the roof of the car to my right, about 6 feet above my head. I stopped. I didn't raise my flashlight right away. I stood still, Harmon's hat in my hand, listening to the rhythm of that breathing in the silence of the yard. It was the same rhythm as before, slow, deep, unhurried. But there was something different now that I was closer. A sound underneath the breathing. Not exactly a growl, more like the friction of something solid against rusted metal. Very faint, repeating in slow cycles, like weight redistributing itself. I raised the flashlight. I saw the leg first. It was folded on the roof of the car, about 16 inches from the edge. That was what I could describe with precision. A leg, a knee joint in a position that a human knee doesn't occupy. The proportion between the hip and where the ankle should have been too long. The hide was irregular, in dark tufts over grayish skin that caught a slight sheen in the flashlight beam, stretched across the joint like there wasn't quite enough material to cover the structure underneath. I didn't see more than that. Not because there was more to see and I looked away. There was fog, there was shadow. There was the limit of what an inspection flashlight illuminates on the roof of a freight car. I saw that folded leg and the edge of the larger shape behind it. Dark, and I stopped. The breathing stopped with it. The silence that followed was absolute. Then the weight shifted. I felt it before I heard it. A vibration in the rail beneath my feet, rising through the ballast, reaching the soles of my boots. The entire car responded with a low, metallic groan as the center of gravity up top changed position. Slow, deliberate. It was coming toward me. I ran. I didn't decide to run. My body decided for me, which was probably the right call. 12, 15 steps to the next cross corridor, turned left without slowing, the ballast unstable under my boots, my knee completely forgetting it had opinions about running on uneven surfaces. Behind me came impacts, 1, 2, on the car roof tracking my movement, heavier than any footstep, with an interval between them that covered too much distance at once. I didn't look back. The cross corridor brought me out to the central axis. I turned north toward the office, and that's when I nearly ran into Harmon. He was standing on the central axis with his flashlight off, looking at the opposite side of the branch with an expression I could only make out because the sky had lightened enough. It wasn't panic. It was the face of someone who had seen something and stayed where he was because the options for movement had evaporated. I grabbed him by the arm without stopping. Move. He moved. He didn't ask anything. I didn't explain anything. Behind us, on the east side of the branch now, there was a single impact on metal. Then silence. Then nothing. We reached the office in 2 minutes. Celia was already there, standing by the window, and when she saw us come in, she closed the door before I even reached for the handle. Harmon came in, sat down in the first chair and stared at the hat I'd handed back to him in the corridor, without remembering when I'd done that. "My hat," he said. "It was in the ballast." He nodded like that made sense. 11 minutes until the consist cleared. I stood in the middle of the room with my hands on my knees, breathing. The flashlight was still in my hand. At some point during the run, it had gone out. Battery, most likely. Or the impact when I stumbled on the third stretch of ballast and barely caught myself. I hadn't noticed. Celia looked at me, looked at my hand, at the dead flashlight. She didn't say anything. Outside, the Noche yard was completely silent and the sky up above had finally made up its mind to get light. The consist cleared at 6:12 in the morning. I heard the brakes release, the groan of the couplings pulling taut, and then the gradual sound of the train picking up speed on the main axis and heading out through the north end of the yard. It took about 4 minutes for the silence to come back completely. I stood at the office window watching the signal lights disappear into the mist, and when there was nothing left to look at, I kept looking anyway for a while longer. Harmon had fallen asleep in the chair. Not from exhaustion, from shock most likely, which sometimes looks like exhaustion from the outside but has a different quality, heavier, that you recognize when you've seen it before. He was holding the beanie in his hand, fingers curled around the brim, breathing with the regularity of someone who'd gone somewhere deeper than normal sleep. I left him there. Celia was at the other desk, writing in a notepad. Not the official report. That was going to need a lot more time and a lot more decisions to put together. It was something else, a list, and I didn't ask what it was because there was a concentration in the way she held her pen that asked not to be interrupted. I got fresh flashlights from the supply cabinet, 2 of them, full batteries. I also grabbed a backup radio because mine had been running low on volume since the run, and I didn't trust it. I put my jacket back on. "I'm going to check what's out there," I said to Celia. She looked up from the notepad. "Alone?" "Almost daylight, consists gone. 15 minutes. She looked at me for a moment with that quiet assessment I was already learning to recognize as her way of processing risk. Then she went back to the notepad. Radio on. I went out. The Noche yard at dawn is a completely different place from the Noche yard at 4 in the morning. The shadows clear out, the fog starts breaking up from the center toward the edges, and the metal on the cars picks up an orange tone that almost looks warm even when it's frozen. I'd worked enough of both shifts to know that the light doesn't actually solve anything. The spaces are the same size, the shadows under the cars just as deep, but it makes a difference anyway. I can't explain why, and I suspect any explanation would be a lie. I went in on the east axis where I'd run. The marks from my own passage were still in the ballast, the uneven pattern of someone running without watching where they stepped. Rocks kicked out to the sides. One of them turned flat side up where my boot had come down at a different angle. I read my own trail like it belonged to someone else. Then I found the others. They were deeper than the marks I'd photographed earlier. Much deeper. Not in the same spot, but parallel to my path on the left side. As if whatever it was had run alongside me rather than behind me. 2.5 feet between each depression. Rocks displaced outward with a violence the earlier marks hadn't had. When I crouched down for a closer look, I saw that some of the ballast stones had cracked. Not displaced. Cracked. The limestone split straight through with enough pressure to do that. I knelt there for a stretch of time that was probably too long. I tried to calculate the weight required to crack railway ballast stone in motion. I didn't arrive at a number that left me comfortable with any conclusion. I continued north, following the marks. They ended at the cross corridor where I'd turned and nearly run into Harmon. There the rocks were more disturbed than at any other point. A circle about 6 feet across where the ballast had been completely rearranged, as if something had stopped abruptly and shifted its weight around several times in the same spot. At the center of that circle there was a dark pool that took me a few seconds to identify. It was saliva, not blood. I know the difference, and the difference matters. It was saliva, thick, cooling in the morning cold, with a thin foam at the edge that meant it hadn't been there long. The amount was disturbing not for what it suggested about violence, but for what it suggested about size. It's not the kind of thing you can overlook once you understand what you're looking at. I photographed it, pocketed my phone, kept going. The reefer was 50 yards ahead. The door I'd closed in the middle of the night was open again, not ajar the way it had been before. Fully open, thrown back against the side of the car with enough force to bend the lower hinge. The seal that had been on the ground earlier was now about 10 feet from where it had been, as if it had been kicked without intent. I didn't go inside the car. I stood in the opening with my flashlight aimed in. The ventilation grate that had been bent outward in the early morning hours, the one Celia and I had looked at and not discussed beyond what was necessary, had been completely removed. It wasn't on the floor of the car, wasn't in the opening. It wasn't anywhere I could see. Gone, which meant it had come out through the hole in the wall somehow, and the hole was now just a dark rectangle in the back wall, about 16 inches wide by 24 inches tall. There was something else. On the metal floor of the car, near the wall where the grate had been, there was an impression. Not a claw mark, not a cut, not anything I would have expected to find. It was a pressure impression. The floor metal very slightly sunk in a circular area about 12 inches across, as if considerable weight had stood at that spot long enough to deform the steel. A posture mark from something that had been standing there, inside the sealed refrigerated car, waiting. I closed the door carefully, even with the bent hinge. The gesture had no practical purpose, and I knew it. I did it anyway. On the way back to the office, I passed the flat car with the gouge on the roof. In daylight with good light, the gouge was different from what I'd seen during the night. Not just a single dent, but a series of parallel dents, 4 or 5 of them, spread across about 10 inches of width. The spacing between them was regular. Irregular in the size of each one, but regular in the distance between them. I took a photo. I stared at the photo for too long. Then I looked at my own open hand, at the space between my fingers, and made the comparison I didn't want to make, but that was already made before I even raised my hand. I put my phone away. When I walked into the operations office, Harmon had woken up and was staring at the beanie in his hand, with the expression of someone trying to remember how they got where they are. Celia looked up from the notepad. She didn't say anything. She read something in my expression and didn't ask. I sat down, picked up the HM5 for the 3rd time that morning. This time I finished filling it out. 7:15 in the morning, Darnell called to tell me the shift was over and I could go home. I hung up without answering. Not out of anger. Not for drama. Just because the phrase "you can go home" assumed a simple sequence of actions. Get up, grab my keys, head out through the north gate, drive 20 minutes back to the apartment in Independence. And I was sitting in that chair genuinely trying to figure out if I could do that. If there was any path between the man I'd been at 4 in the morning and my front door that didn't run through what I'd seen. Celia had sent Harmon home at 7. He left without asking anything, the beanie on his head, his eyes that color that belongs to someone who's going to need a few days to get back to who they were before. I understood. I didn't say anything when he left, just raised my hand and he raised his back, and that was enough. Then it was just the two of us. She was finishing the list in the notepad, which I'd understood by that point to be a timeline. Every event, every time, every detail she'd observed or I'd described, organized in order. Celia Marsh, in her first solo month working a night shift rail yard, was putting together a dossier because it was the only way she'd found to hold on to what had happened without letting it slip through. I needed to go get my gear. I'd left my inspection bag hooked on the ladder of the tank car when I'd climbed up in the middle of the night. Leather bag, 20 years with me, with the log notebook inside, the spare pair of gloves, the thickness gauge I'd borrowed from Ray Kowalczyk last week and still hadn't returned. Losing equipment is the kind of small concrete thing the mind uses as an anchor when it doesn't have anything better to hold on to. Back in 10 minutes, I told Celia. She looked up. Owen, 10 minutes, daylight, empty yard, consists gone. She looked at me for a stretch of time that was longer than the situation called for. There was something in her expression that I recognized without being able to name right then. Only later, driving home, did I understand it was the same look my daughter used to give me when I left for the overnight shift while she was still little. Not fear, something more specific. The awareness that distance exists between people and that distance sometimes has consequences. My daughter lives in Portland now. I haven't seen her in person in 3 years. I left before I thought about that any further. The South Branch in the morning light was almost unsettling in the wrong way. The way places where bad things happened go quiet afterward, as if the space holds no memory of anything. The cars were in their final positions after the maneuver. The fog had cleared away almost completely, and there was a pigeon walking along the roof of the flat car with the complete indifference of something that doesn't know and doesn't need to know. I found the bag where I'd left it, hooked on the side ladder of the tank car, damp with dew but intact. I grabbed it, put it over my shoulder. I was climbing down when I heard it. Not the breathing this time, something different. A sound that took me a few seconds to identify because it was out of context. A slow, continuous creak coming from inside the tank car, like pressure being applied against the metal shell from the inside out. Not a knock, not an impact. Steady pressure, patient, which the metal was resisting but communicating clearly had its limits. I came down the last few rungs slowly. I stopped on the ballast. The creaking continued for about 10 seconds, and then stopped. The silence that followed had that specific quality I already knew. The kind that takes up space, that has its own weight, that isn't the absence of sound, but the presence of something that has decided to go quiet. My radio was in my pocket. Celia was 300 yards away. I had 2 fully charged flashlights and a 20-year-old leather bag and a borrowed thickness gauge. I should have called her. I know that now. I know it, and I don't have an explanation that fully satisfies me for why I didn't. There was something, not courage, because courage is when you know the risk and choose to face it. And I didn't know exactly what the risk was at that moment. It was something else. It was the exhaustion of a whole night of not knowing, of photographing marks and closing doors and running in the dark without seeing what was chasing me. There was a part of me that was, in a completely irrational way, tired of not seeing. So I went around the car. It was on the other side, the side with its back to the operations office, facing the outer perimeter wall of the yard. It was on the ground, not the roof, crouched against the side of the tank car in a posture that was not natural for any structure I could name. Legs folded at a very tight angle, arms, if they were arms, resting on the ballast, head low between the shoulders in a way that hid the face completely. I saw the back. I saw the irregular hide, dark tufts over grayish skin, stretched over a spine that was the wrong length. I saw the hands on the ballast, the claws dull and thick, uneven, pressed into the rocks without any visible effort, like fingers in soft sand. It had its back to me. It hadn't heard me coming. Or it had and didn't care. I stood still about 20 feet away. My heart was doing something I technically knew to be a normal physiological response to fear, but that in practice felt completely out of proportion. Too fast, too loud, inconveniently audible in the absolute silence of that corridor. And that's when the impossible decision came. Because there was something beyond it, against the outer wall of the yard. About 6 feet from the creature, motionless, lying on its side in the ballast between the wall and the tank car. It was Harmon, the dark navy beanie still on his head, orange vest facing up, eyes open. I couldn't tell, at that moment, whether he was alive. There was no movement, no visible sign. There was a man lying in the ballast 6 feet from the largest thing I have ever seen up close in my life, and I was 20 feet away with a leather bag on my shoulder and 2 flashlights and absolutely no plan. I thought about things that made no sense. I thought that Harmon must have come back without my knowing, must have come in through the south axis instead of leaving through the north gate. I thought about Ray Kowalczyk's thickness gauge, that I still hadn't returned. I thought specifically and absurdly that I hadn't had any coffee that morning. The creature moved, not toward me. It turned slightly in Harmon's direction, a postural adjustment, slow, like someone repositioning in sleep. The head stayed down. The claws came out of the ballast with a dry sound, rocks settling, and repositioned themselves about a foot forward. I had the radio in my pocket. If I called Celia, she would come. She was 300 yards away with young legs and an orange vest and the timeline she was finishing in the notepad. She'd come, and then we'd have 2 people 20 feet from that thing instead of 1. And I didn't know what that solved, but I knew what it risked. If I didn't call, I was alone. I pulled the radio from my pocket slowly. Too slowly, probably, with the kind of excessive care that adrenaline produces when you're trying to compensate for fear with motor control. I pressed the button without speaking. A single click. The signal that Celia and I hadn't arranged, but that I hoped she'd read as something, anything, even if it was just I'm alive and I've got the radio in my hand. The creature stopped. The head rose. Not fast, not in a jerk. Slowly, with that quality of movement I'd been trying to describe to myself all night without finding the right word. Deliberate, as if every millimeter was a conscious choice. I didn't see the face. The angle wasn't right. The morning light was coming from the wrong side, and there was enough shadow between the car and the wall that the face stayed in the dark. But I saw the head turn in my direction, and I stood still, radio in hand, bag on my shoulder. The cold November morning light in Kansas City hitting everything around me, completely motionless, looking at the thing that was looking at me. Harmon groaned. Low, involuntary. The kind of sound a person makes when they're waking up from somewhere deep and don't yet know where they are. He was alive. He was alive and he was waking up. And when he came fully awake, he was going to see what I was seeing, and he was going to make a sound that would be neither low nor involuntary. I made a decision. I don't know if it was the right one. I still think about it, months later, and I can't reach a conclusion that gives me any peace. I know what I did. I know the outcome. I don't know if there was another option or if there were several better options I simply didn't see because I was exhausted and cold and hadn't had coffee since 3 in the morning. I threw the flashlight, not at the creature, to the opposite side against the car on the left, where it hit with a loud metallic clang and echoed down the corridor. A sharp, unambiguous noise in a silence that had lasted too long. The creature turned toward the sound. I grabbed Harmon by the vest and pulled. Harmon didn't ask anything. That's what stayed with me most in the days that followed. Not what happened in the corridor, not what I saw before I threw the flashlight, but Harmon's silence as I dragged him by the vest across the last 50 yards to the north gate. He was awake. He was on his feet or close to it, legs moving on instinct while I pulled. Eyes open. But he didn't ask anything, didn't say anything. Didn't turn his head back once. Sometimes I think he saw more than I did in that corridor. Sometimes I think it was exactly the opposite. We came through the north gate at 7:42. The security guard, a new kid I didn't know by name, he'd started the week before, looked at the two of us with the expression of someone deciding whether to ask something and deciding not to. Good call. We had nothing to give him. Celia was already outside. I don't know how she got there before us. Maybe she left when she heard the radio click. Maybe she left before that for some reason she never fully explained. She was standing by my car with her hands in her jacket pockets and the notepad tucked under her arm. And when she saw us coming, she looked at me with an expression I read as relief, but that months later, thinking back on it, I'm not sure that's what it was. We handed Harmon off to her. He went without resistance. I stood on the sidewalk looking at the Noche yard from the outside for the first time that morning. From the north gate, you don't see much. The concrete wall, the signal lights, the ends of the nearest cars. Nothing of the south branch, nothing of the east axis, nothing of any corridor between any cars. Just metal and fog that was almost entirely gone by then, leaving the November sky visible, light gray, with nothing particular to offer. I stopped at the gas station bathroom on Route 169 before getting in the car. I looked at myself in the mirror for long enough to be strange about it. I didn't see anything different, which was simultaneously reassuring and unsettling in a way I couldn't resolve. 22 years in a rail yard leave visible marks on a man. The hands, the lines around the eyes from squinting against wind and sun and flashlight glare. But that morning hadn't left anything visible. I looked exactly like the same man who had walked into the yard at 4 in the morning with an HM5 form to fill out. That didn't seem right. I can't fully explain why. I drove the 20 minutes to Independence on autopilot. Parked in front of the building. Went up, made coffee that sat in the maker undrunk. I called my daughter in Portland at 9 in the morning, which was too early for her. And when she picked up with sleep in her voice, I didn't know what to say, so I said I was calling for no reason. Just to hear her voice. She was quiet for a second and then said that was fine, she was sleeping, and I said I knew and told her to go back to sleep. She didn't hang up right away. She stayed on the line for another 10 seconds or so without saying anything. Then she hung up. The report I handed Darnell that afternoon documented the broken seal, the dent on the flat car, the removed ventilation grate, and the bent hinge on the reefer. Unidentified suspicious presence in the yard. Recommendation for full inspection of all cars on the South Branch. Technical language. Objective, nothing that a reasonable man couldn't read without raising an eyebrow. Darnell read it, signed it, filed it. He never asked me anything beyond the report. Harmon put in for a transfer to another yard the following week. He got it. I was the one who signed the release form, which at the time struck me as a small, humorless irony. He sent me a message before he left, 2 lines. "Thanks for the South Branch. Good luck." Nothing more. I didn't respond right away, and by the time I went to reply, the conversation had disappeared from my phone in a way I couldn't explain. Could be I deleted it myself without realizing. I'm not sure. Celia is still at the Noche yard. She works the night shifts when she can choose them, which I never fully understood. Once, weeks later, we walked through the South Branch together during a routine inspection, and I watched her out of the corner of my eye to see if there was any hesitation, any sign that she was feeling what I felt every time I entered that branch. A weight in the chest, that awareness of space, the attention that goes automatically to the shadows under the cars. She walked at her normal pace, noted what she needed to note, didn't look down once. I don't know what that says about her. I don't know what it says about me. The Noche yard kept operating. The trains kept coming and going. The reports kept getting filled out and filed. In December, there was a year-end party in the cafeteria of the main warehouse, and I went for about 40 minutes, ate a piece of cake that was dry, talked to Ray Kowalczyk about wear patterns on the new fleet's wheel sets. I didn't mention anything. Neither did Ray. Which brings me to the one thing I can't organize in any satisfying way, months later, with enough distance to try to be rational about it. On the morning I left the South Branch with Harmon before reaching the North Gate, I passed the corridor where I'd thrown the flashlight. It was for just a second. I didn't stop, didn't slow my pace. But I looked. The flashlight was in the ballast where it had fallen. The leather bag was on the ground where I'd dropped it when I grabbed Harmon. The rocks around the area were scuffed up from the running, everything where it should be. Except for one thing, the seal. The reefer's seal that had fallen to the ballast, that I'd seen about 10 feet away during the night, had moved again. It was no longer in the corridor. It was on top of the tank car, at the top of the side ladder, resting on the platform grate as if someone had climbed up, walked over to it, and set it there. I didn't photograph it. I don't know why I didn't photograph it. I know that I saw it. I know it was there. Sometimes I think the thing had left when the consist came in during the night, pushed out of the branch by the cars closing in around it, and that what I saw in the corridor that morning was what was left of a long night with no sleep and no coffee. Sometimes I think something else. The Noche yard sits on the outskirts of Kansas City, 2 kilometers from the Missouri River, and runs 200 yards wide by 400 long, with 17 branches, 4 maintenance warehouses, and capacity for 800 cars at once. I know every inch of that place. I think about that I know every inch, and that knowing every inch of a place means nothing about what that place knows of you.